there's a million different questions that I've now popped into my mind from everything you shared, but I know that I promised you a certain time designation and I don't want to take up your whole evening. So
it's more than okay. Yeah.
It's completely fine.
Okay. Are you okay transitioning to the kind of next portion?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So this is just a little bit about representation, which I don't know if you two planned this, but everything that we're talking about just flows perfectly, has just been flowing perfectly into the next topic. So in terms of representation, you and I spoke a little bit earlier about it, but I'm curious to know, also inviting you into the conversation. Do you want to mention your pronouns?
Yeah, I just go by he, them. Oh, sorry. He, him.
Yeah,
Perfect.
This is Dan.
Sorry.
That works. That works. I put you on the spot, so I understand. But I'm interested to know if either of you are comfortable talking about, and I can also speak to, kind of what it means to have representation and visibility in the sex industry, in this industry that, as we know, is like huge, right? People can build empires. People can have so many different ways of experiencing this. We've touched on the old school kind of like people being forced into street work. A lot of my girlfriends worked on the streets. There was no other option. And now with the online visibility movement, I think, as you said, Mimi, like it's the first wave of visibility. I think there's got to be some generation turnover for it to be a little more normalized. But I'm interested to hear if either of you are feeling excited about the way representation is happening, or if you have any critiques or general feedback. And this can be about representation of sexuality, gender, race, anything.
And for me, it's a double-sided coin. Both it's positive and negative. I think one issue is like probably both of us, because due to our looks, we do get by most people kind of get shoehorned into just certain things only. Like for me, for example, I know for sure.
Do you want to talk about the
I was gonna get
the
to
offensive thing that you were almost casted
so
in?
I'm gonna get to that. So like like when I know I'm so used to it to the point where like I know when someone looks at me, it's like, oh, they're like, oh, it's twink, or like, are they into old or young, or are they a chaser? It's like it's always, oh, they that being Asian and being slim is that, oh, it must be the submissive bottom. It's all it's like the automatic shoehorns that into that look, and it's like I both understand, and it's also like frustrating because it's like you'd also want to be able to branch out, do something else, and like she just spoke about, I had to decline an offer because like this was like a peak Squid Game, when that was all that popular. Me, just because I'm Asian, they want to cast me for a Squid Game type parody.
It was specifically because you were Korean, and
yeah,
that was it.
Pretty much. It was like there was nothing like it's like,
which is like at the time that this happened, his social media was just constantly getting flooded with like, oh my God, it's the guy from Squid Game.
I saw that and I was so
yesterday I didn't have a comment about it. I'm just like, really? We're still on this?
It's just
I they both have like kind of shaggy hair, but that's really it.
It's just funny to me because this might be offensive, but it's like if we were to go back like 50, 60 years ago, it's like the casting a movie. Oh, that person is of a color, so they just cast them. It doesn't matter because it's like like it just fits the look. It's like like it's one of those things. I know if this were to be done to a Caucasian performer, this would be a lot bigger news because they'd be like, oh, you're just saying because they kind of look alike, that must be them. But because this is not being a copy, like an outside, like, oh, what, they kind of look alike. It's just in a way, it just shows people have a lot more as a society growing room. There's a lot more growing room.
I read one of the comments that one of you responded to, or maybe it was someone else, but they said, wow, you must not really. This was in response to someone saying, like, oh, you do look like that guy from. And I was like, what are people thinking? And so someone responded, you must not really have a lot of exposure to people from
Yeah, I
different
think
ethnicities.
yeah.
Like, like,
Like it's one of those things where I wouldn't even get offended. Like, if I were to get somebody from my like grandfather's era and be like, look at all these Caucasian people. It'd be offensive, but I know exactly what he would say. He'd be like, oh, they all look alike. It's it's like
that was funny.
no, it sucks, but it's just like it just shows that more people need exposure.
Yeah.
Because like that just comes to show that people's as a society their brains just aren't used to seeing different like the small
different people of like a similar ethnic group.
Yeah. The little minute details, the distinctive features that might be more characteristically traits with one ethnicity versus another. So for example, like I'm Middle Eastern. I know I don't look it, but I am. And well, but yeah, people are just like, oh, like where from, which country? Because certain people, if they're also Middle Eastern, they'll recognize right away. They're like, oh, you're from this country, aren't you?
Their brains are used to be able to see that difference. Yeah.
Totally. Whereas someone else who has like very little exposure to people from the Middle East might look at me and just be like, I thought you were just a white girl.
Yeah, it's funny because like I'm so used to it. It's like I don't get like it's like there's no point to get offended. I just like it's like I know this person just like yeah, you gotta get used to it. That's
gotta leave the house more.
Yeah.
Totally. And I totally recognize also, I want to be clear for the people watching. I recognize I'm white. I have all the white privilege. I recognize it. Just want to check that real quick.
Oh, I mean, I'm similar. Like I know me being East Asian, probably gives me a privilege over like some either like people from like the Indian subcontinent or Southeast Asian or like it's one of those things where it's so difficult where I don't even know how to like break down that barrier slowly.
I think it's
sadly I see it in people of African descent. The people with the lighter tone, sadly, from a wider audience, you get higher approval.
Colorism. Mimi, I've yet to hear from you. I know that we're going back and forth, like, yeah. And I'm like, Mimi, what are your thoughts on this representation?
Well, I mean, like, just because it was a topic that, like, definitely isn't like with like that specifically, like that's not my place to really speak on, seeing as like I'm as Caucasian as they come. Look at me, I'm literally glowing from my ring light right now. But in terms of like sexuality and gender, I mean, like specifically, just God, trans women are represented in such a way that is almost just like stereotypical, I feel, of like there's a way in which like trans women are marketed that just reinforces just like some bad stigmas. Like you see a very with bisexual sites, all cisgender models. There's never any trans models on these sites, or like certain big creators rarely working with trans models, like certain big bisexual creators rarely working with trans models, even and when they do, just pairing it with another trans model,
and it has to be very like femme present. Yeah, like they couldn't accept like someone who's like maybe like more like hasn't transitioned as well.
Like just like the scope of like what there is in trans porn it's just so limited compared to like what there is in cis porn. And like a common thing is like, God, with what he said, where like he often gets stereotyped as like a submissive bottom. People often stereotype me the opposite way of like wanting me to be like a dominant femme top. And I'm just like, nope, we don't do that in this house. Sorry, you can find someone else for that, but not me.
It's exhausting.
It really is, and like, you know, continuously trying to push this narrative of like, unless you are, a little queer, like if you are heterosexual male who finds attraction towards trans females, like you're still a heterosexual male.
Because I mean, they're just
But the
being
way like
attacked.
so many transgender sites market their models, it kind of doesn't reinforce that idea, which is something like I really hope changes. I got very lucky where I got to work with a site that like doesn't really use that kind of offensive marketing. Very recently, there have been sites who have, within the past like 4-5 years or so, that have changed their names to, the names used to be very, like the site names to be very offensive, like transphobic slurs, and a lot of their descriptions, even today, there's still sites that use like offensive descriptions for transgender scenes.
I think that's one of the newer like things that needs to like kind of change, is that I think people maybe from the outside of the circle think using these slurs is some kind of a form of like, I mean, I hate to equivalent to this, but maybe it's kind of like N-word, where it's like you don't just throw it out there, like like I I don't like to use word, but like like it's, you don't want to just see some hetero person use the word trans, like it's, but then they get that because sites used to market it that way, and it's like,
Oh, I totally hear you. And I think what you're both speaking to goes back to communication, the importance of language that we have to use. And if you're living in a community, oh, I'm sorry, Mimi, did I cut you off?
No, sorry. But I'm luckily like with models, like speaking out about that kind of stuff, like that stuff is less, like the use of, transphobic slurs on trans sites is definitely something that has gone away for the most part, which I'm very thankful for.
Just all the shitty edge boards out there.
And like I think now, like, God, it's kind of weird to say, but like I feel like trans porn has kind of been on just like, it's kind of just been riding this wave of just going like up and up, like of just like continuously getting more popular and like more people getting exposed to it. But at the same time, there still are a lot of issues that have to be worked out when it comes to trans people in porn. Specifically, like a group you never see represented is trans men. Fortunately, actually recently, a friend of mine she is a trans woman who is a director in this industry. Her name is Penny Petals. She actually recently opened up a site called, I think it's Transnificence, which is specifically focusing on trans men and trans masculine people. And like, there have been a couple sites like that in the past, but those 2 sites actually that I can think of, but those sites have been run by someone who is very predatory, who has been very transphobic to the models that he has worked with. Quite a few of my like trans male like friends in this industry have recently spoken out about like his sites and like working with him. And so it's nice to know that now there is finally a good site that has trans mass representation, that is run by someone who I know like is a good person, and like above all else is also like part of the trans community. I think that's like kind of a big thing, is that like having a trans person make trans porn, it really does make a difference, you know. Having that insight community making that content, it makes the difference.
I don't know how anyone could argue that for
Mm.
any lived experience or identity. Like having someone who has the experience living it is
It's like,
probably going to notice and pay attention to some things that's
exactly. It's like
yes.
the best representation is written by someone who is part of your community.
And I think that's like, in a way, that's probably the best thing about like, in a way, I guess we're seeing a lot more like generational changes, like not just in porn industry, but like more wide range of society. We see more people who are, I guess, closer to our age group becoming, you know, more representative. Because like, sadly, I think the biggest issue is that a lot of these things, or porn sites, or even any sort of industry head, end of the day, were run by older people, and
Specifically a lot of old white men.
sadly enough, the problem is that they have it, you know, if they have their mindset on one thing, there is no changing that. And, you know, it doesn't matter who is saying it or where it's coming from. There's no changing those minds. Yeah.
And you know, a common argument you hear a lot is like, oh, well, it's just porn. It's not that deep. But it's like, no, porn really does lead to the normalization of things, whether good or bad.
I
You
mean,
know,
just
without porn, we wouldn't really have DVDs. We wouldn't really have like streaming sites.
they're all like, porn's always been leading in technology.
Like, and like leading in kind of societal views, I guess.
Well, yeah, it's due to porn, where a term like MILF is a positive term. It's, you know, it's not a derogatory thing. You know, that through porn, terms like MILF, cougar, you know, or like twink, and all that,
Appreciating like
that
attract like older women are attractive, you know.
I'm like, watch it because I'm a MILF. I think that
Yeah.
there's definitely truth to what all of y'all are saying. And this makes me think of the recent, maybe for people who are having a hard time following who watch this, I think of, I'll just touch on this very quickly. The person who made the statement from Victoria's Secret saying, no trans people, no fat people. And it's like, you have an old white dude.
Yeah.
And I have no personal vendetta against anyone just because they are who they are. I usually want people to prove who they are to me first. But like old white dudes in positions of power just kind of have a trend of doing shit like that. And it's like,
the only problem is like the only other people they listen to are other older white men.
yeah.
And so like, it's kind of funny. The reason like I think about this is like, I hate to derail this, like me being a history dork. A lot of our wars in the past were literally fought because people could not appreciate somebody else's culture or background. Like, I think if I remember right, the Opium War started because whoever was the prime minister of England at that point went to Qing Dynasty and met with the king. The problem is that this prime minister was like, hey, I only bow my head to the king of England. I don't bow my head to you. And they were like, what the fuck? And, you know, like vice versa. If somebody from that dynasty were to send somebody to England, they're like, I'm not bowing to that king. He's not my emperor. And it's just like, you know, the fact that because people could not just respect one another.
I tell this to my students. I appreciate you bringing up the history lesson. Like, it's one of the leading causes of war throughout the entire human civilization, of this difference of religion and land, mainly religious ideologies and differences, but just this narcissism, this ego, this lack of openness. And it sounds like you two have a lot of openness in your hearts. And I think that's why I appreciate you both. And while I think all three of us are still learning, still growing,
Definitely,
Still,
yeah.
I'll speak for myself. I'm still so far from perfect.
Mm,
I think that it should be okay for us to have conversations like this
Oh, absolutely.
that might not be perfect, but that explore ways we want to see things change and improve,
mhm.
even if not for our generation, but for the next. And
Oh, absolutely. Because you know, like the only way, the only way we could do anything about curiosity is to figure out and what's the best way, but to just openly talk about it. Like, you know, it's like maybe at the end of the day, if people could let down a little bit of their pride, like, you know, the only way you learn is to be able to talk about things. And yeah, we're going to talk about things that might make them uncomfortable. But you have to let go of that pride because, you know, you have no idea who the person you're talking to, where they came from, what their background is, and what they might know and not know.
yeah.
And yeah.
Oh my God, y'all, we're getting deep. I think that people are going to be surprised that we have so many complex ideas. And
Who would have thought? Porn stars have thoughts.
yeah, now this does kind of bring us to our near close. Are we okay moving in that direction? So when it comes to, I mean, we've covered so many things. We've covered individual experience. We've covered managing a relationship and communication and how that's a part of it. We've also covered representation and what that means and what that's like, how important it is. Out of all the things that we've covered, is there anything that you can think of that you want to add or revisit, revise something you said earlier, or expand on?
I mean, God, just thinking more about like, I guess in terms of what I said of like how trans women being represented like in porn and everything, you know, we really have to get past this idea of like, how do I say it? That's the best. Let me think. There's a lot of male talent in the industry who definitely lusts after trans performers, but would never publicly work with them. And
So like real life.
yeah. And it's like when you try to call people out on that, they're like, well, it's not transphobic to want to work with you. But it's like, well, here's the thing. I know that you're attracted to me, but you don't want to publicly admit that because I'm trans. That is where the transphobia comes from. You know, people always like to say like, oh, it's not transphobic, it's not racist to have a preference. But it's like, what's your reasoning though? Your reasoning is most likely going to be rooted in those things. You know, like the other day, God, there was a performer in this industry who had said like, I don't do scenes with people of color. And it's like,
they literally could have just stopped there, but when they emphasized it, that's when it really is like, because what they emphasized, it was like, oh, I think they emphasized that.
At first they said like, they specifically said like, I don't do scenes with Black men, which already in itself is like terrible, racist. But then when got called out, they kind of doubled down with, oh, I'm not racist. I was just saying I would never do a scene with people of color.
And then it was like, oh, because they said they have never physically ever been attracted to anyone who is
specifically, They said specifically like, I have not seen a single Black man that I have found attractive.
And that, you know, it's just one of the things where it's just like, you know, it's just a sort of statement.
Yeah.
Because it's like you haven't seen everybody.
And I remember her reasoning was like, oh, there's just facial and bone structures that I'm like attracted to.
And it's like, ooh, you're Nazi there.
Yeah, it's like they're
That
ooh,
is so
they're
cringe.
very, it's like that's such a common thing too. It's like
I know.
you have both like the fetishization of races and of trans people. You have the fetishization of like marginalized groups, but you also have like the active discrimination against them as well.
I think that's
In
Open.
I think one of the things is that I don't think people, that's the sad part, because people who we easily can perceive as racist, the biggest problem is that they themselves do not see it at all.
Mhm.
Mm, mm,
Like sure, maybe like someone can maybe they aren't a wholehearted racist, but it's like you are
Yeah.
holding some ideologies
And they
that
don't,
are definitely rooted
and-
in racism.
and they don't realize they don't realize that there's a toxicity that, like, it's deep rooted, that
Mhm.
they don't I if I were, oh god, what's his name, the guy who I it kind of divulged, there was a guy who did that one shitty movies, Taken. Oh yeah, that guy. I
Liam
remember,
Neeson.
yeah, I remember reading a story about like someone who he was very close to was sexually assaulted by a person who was of a African descent. And he spoke about how for many years he kind of held on to that resentment towards that race. But
ooh.
then like he like looked himself in the mirror and realized how what he was thinking was prejudice. And I people didn't, I thought that was really 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 big to talk about, because I think that's one of the biggest things is that people, if only people could talk about what they, what's inside, and if they verbally talk, like, because they don't never talk about it, they don't realize how toxic it is.
Mhm.
Like, you just hold it in and nobody else is there to, like, hey, show a different viewpoint to it.
Mhm. Like we don't really create like there needs to be room for people to be able to admit like, hey, I'm realizing some thoughts I had weren't the best. I educated myself and realized like this is rooted in something very shitty.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I've educated myself and I'm actively changing my mindset and trying to unlearn this thing that I've like known.
And yeah, I think people should realize that it's okay to talk about, like, if someone of a different race were to talk to me about, like, they might have a negative viewpoint about someone who's Korean or Asian. If I have a chance to talk about it, I think that would give an opportunity to be able to change that mindset. But if without any sort of space to talk about it, that mindset will never change.
You're both touching on such deep topics that are so globally important. These are conversations that are important on a global scale. And I think the one thing that I think of, I'm just going to highlight on two things that you've both spoken to. One thing I think of is cancel culture and how toxic it's made spaces that I think, from my experience, cancel culture has kind of created a fear in people where, one, they either don't want to talk about anything because they don't want to get it wrong and get canceled. So now we're losing conversations about racism or internal issues or ideologies that we can work at.
Yeah.
Two, there are people that are like, you're just using a word. You're just trying to label me. I don't know why I'm doing a Southern accent. Sorry. But they're like, I don't know why you're trying to label me. That's like so whatever. You're just like so sensitive. And they try to just dismiss it. So people are like afraid of talking, or I feel like they feel emboldened of like, my ideology is not problematic. You're just sensitive. And it's like, why can't we just be open to admitting that we're all part of, around the world, different ideologies and thoughts that teach us, socially condition us to believe certain things? And I know that I can speak for the US that like whiteness is the most represented. in politics, in media, everywhere. So that's got to affect our ideology about what we might find attractive.
Well,
It's
I think in a way, like maybe because yeah, I think that it's terrible, but like so like to go back on the cancel culture, because to me, like I feel like sadly we've always kind of had cancel culture. It's just like we kind of labeled different names throughout history,
sure.
and yeah, but like that's totally it really is true, and I think part of it is in a way that a lot of people, hey, if they're like, hey, if I can hide my flaws while I point fingers at somebody else, that protects me. And I feel like certainly
Oh, yeah.
an aspect that's kind of what we see in the current climate is as soon as we figure out somebody has said something bad in the past or now, everybody wants to divulge on that person because they're like, as long as the spotlight is on this person, this won't come onto me.
Ooh, that's real. I feel like what we're missing is conversations that are based in accountability.
It's well, like you said, like problem is like we expect the people we like, the people we follow to be perfect. That
Oh, mm,
you know, at the end of the day, everybody has a flaw, and if we that because as a society we give them so much backlash at if anything comes along that way that there's there's no space to be able to speak about it, and you know, like because of that, it doesn't nothing changes.
yeah. Mimi, did you?
I mean, there's not really anything that like I can think to add. I think, well, no, I think like a big part of it is that like people are so quick to dismiss emotional responses to things like
Oh,
that.
yeah.
Like someone, like saying something like about a marginalized group, people are going to have an emotional response to that because those are people you're talking about, you know?
Huh.
And people, and like, whoever's in the hot seat, like they're always so quick to just kind of be like, again, like, oh, you're so sensitive and like, oh, cancel culture. But it's like, no, you're talking about like actual people here, you know? People aren't like people aren't like numbers and statistics.
Disposable.
Like people have feelings, and if you say something negative about like a certain marginalized group, people are allowed to be angry about that, and like more than that, like they also aren't at liberty to educate you because it's not their job, you know when people say like, oh well, I didn't know, like why didn't you like why don't you try to educate me instead of getting like angry? But it's like it's not their job. You can't bear that's just shifting the weight of responsibility onto them, when it's like, no, specifically for like, for me and like for other white people, it is our personal responsibility as white people to actively educate ourselves and unlearn like both the subtle and not so subtle like racist ideologies and messages that like we have been brought up on, you know like because racism isn't just like, it's not always so obvious, but it's like you still have to educate yourself on those more subtle ideas and those subtle notions, and actively like teach yourself not to think that way anymore, and to remember like, wait, this thought, like, this isn't good, this is rooted in some shitty ideology, I need to stop thinking that way.
I love that you. Oh, did I cut you off, Dan?
No,
Sorry.
no. No, she's right. I was just agreeing with it.
Oh, I just love that you're keeping some accountability on our whiteness. I know that you and I can speak to that especially for white people and for everyone, it's important that we unlearn, that we investigate how we've been conditioned to think, believe, feel about people. And I think that it's deeply sad that instead of when someone calls attention to a statement made that can hurt people's feelings, instead of someone being open to that and going, you know, I'm not interested in being this like rude and hurtful and dismissive of an entire group of billions of people of color, that's billions of people. Instead, you know, yeah, I'm sorry, I fucked up, I just I'll work on it. Like, just it's so not
so
hard to
easy
even
be
just do
like,
that.
yeah, it's so easy to just be like, I like, you know, like it's so easy to just apologize and take accountability for what you said. And like, I think another big part of it is that like, this is just based off like some real events that like I kind of have seen specifically in the sex work industry, um, of people who think like they're owed forgiveness. When it's like, just because you apologize, people aren't at liberty to forgive you, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't apologize. You know, being a decent person doesn't warrant you rewards. Being respectful of people does not warrant you praise.
Yeah, not being super offensive doesn't mean you get a gold star. That's just how you should be. Ugh.
And I think that that's kind of like another part of like why people get so defensive and so like apprehensive towards changing, is that they're kind of just like, well, what's in it for me? That's like, nothing should be in it for you. You should just want to be a good person.
I think one of the things is that, in a way, I think we as people maybe haven't adapted. People haven't realized that just what's changed in the last 20 years is like in a way kind of a bigger change in society than it has like 50 years ago. Because I think one of the things is that like people don't realize, because of things like Twitter or Instagram, you know, even in older social media format, it was more, if you like MySpace or Facebook, for example, when you post something, you're only posting it to your circle and to your echo chamber.
Yeah.
Whereas something like Instagram or Facebook, I don't think people have wrapped it around their mind. When you say something on there is no barrier. It literally can reach anybody. And and I don't think people have adapted to that responsibility, that they don't realize is, you know, when you say that, you're not just saying it amongst your friends. Everybody could see it and everybody hear it, and it also doesn't disappear.
Yeah. Ooh, that's hitting close to home. And I'm not gonna sit here and pretend I'm perfect. I've spent years trying to unlearn a lot of problematic ideologies I've had and whatnot. And
oh no, I think that's what it is. Like, it's just I think, you know, we're kind of in between that generation where a lot of this has changed. In a way, a lot of the old people have never adapted. I think that's one of the things why what we see is that they've always say these crazy things. It's just that now there's a format to be able to echo those words even louder.
And I think like another big part of it is that like, it's so easy to just say, oh, it's just like the older generation that speaks this way, you know, like the common thing of like, you know, just old straight white men. But it's like, no, these ideas are kind of a bit prevalent everywhere.
Oh yeah, because it's that stuff is passed down. So like for me, I'll use myself for example. Me being ethnically Korean, if anybody who has any sort of knowledge in that area's history knows it's always been problematic. So, you know, like someone who's of Caucasian here might not know, but like, you know, if you put a Korean person and a Japanese person in a room, there's going to be some friction,
potential for tension.
but it's like but because a lot of people are not used to that kind of history and tension, they just go, what's wrong with these people? And it's not, and I think you'll see everywhere. You'll see it. I think you see regional differences in this country, or religious or race. People don't realize that when you say that now, it's not just it's not just here. It's to everybody. And when you say it around, that's what we probably get a lot of our biased views from how we grew up. It's our surrounding.
Yeah.
It's I saw my mother say negative things about a Japanese person, because it's a cultural thing that's just been passed down, and nobody has really stepped in to say this is not healthy. You look at like right now, look at Israel and Palestinian people. I don't believe there is really just true, clean cut, good and bad. There are, wherever you go, there are good people, bad people, strange people, weird people. Just because someone's of a certain ethnicity or a certain background, not everybody there are great people, not everybody are bad people. And I think in a way, we just clean cut. I like this, I support this, I don't support this, I fight that.
I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
I think what you're speaking to are generalizations, and how we sometimes just make these huge sweeping generalizations on entire populations of people. And I want to encourage anyone who's viewing this to do their history, educate themselves on their history of Korea, how Korea became South and North Korea, and I won't speak to it because it's not my history, but I've educated myself about it, but why there might be potential tension between someone who of Japanese descent and Korean descent. And I think I encourage people to educate themselves about this. And I appreciate you sharing your experience, your openness, willingness to be vulnerable and speak to that. And I think that you really bring it home when you're talking about these generalizations, like they're dangerous to make. I think that we could all think of ways.
It's in a way, like as a race, even this country, I feel like that's what hold us. Like, I'm making a very huge claim, but I believe as Asian Americans, that's kind of what holds us back. Like, and in terms of representation, in terms of being seen by everybody, because if you look at African Americans, if you look at Hispanic people, those African Americans aren't just one African American. They're of a Senegalese descent or descendants growing up in the United States, but they come together as African Americans. Hispanic people, maybe Mexican, Cuban, but they come together as Hispanic American or Latinx. You don't really see that with Asian Americans or any Asian representation. It's no Korean, it's Chinese, it's Japanese, it's Taiwan. And if you're different, I don't really care about you, because I only care about my people. I feel like that's very dangerous.
I cannot speak to the Asian American or Asian experience. I can only speak to
it's one of the things I never see being spoken about, but it's like if you're around it, it's a friction you could see.
Totally. I was going to add in my own way that being of Middle Eastern descent, it is a reality that I've witnessed, like different ethnic groups under this umbrella term that I think people are just like, well, and if they're not part of that ethnic group, they're just kind of like, well, all of you are like that. And then if you are a part of the ethnic group, you're like, well, no, actually we're completely different. And like, like there's just this like close-knit experience. And then you might have someone of a different ethnic Middle Eastern descent who's like, y'all are super different. Like, we mind our business, you mind yours. And I'm like, oh, but can we be best friends?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. And I feel like that's, as a group, that, something that should be, if we talked about it, it would be a lot less issue.
Mhm.
I think that this is one of the most like complex, like we've touched on, I don't know what the word is. I don't know what the word is, but this is one of the most like rich, let's call it that, one of the most rich discussions I've had in quite a while. I am deeply appreciative of you both. And I'm interested in continuing this conversation.
I'd be
We can
really
totally do another episode. We
Yeah,
can
definitely.
expand, if Dan, if you want to do like a whole episode on history and just school people, go for it. Mimi, if you want to do a whole episode on what it means to have rights and representation
Mhm.
in government, we can do a whole episode on that. Unfortunately, I do have to get going.
Yeah.
Oops.
We
So
did
I
kind of go off
All
on
right.
like some tangents a bit. Yeah.
no, this was so informing and so important for you two to have space for your voices to be heard. And they're gonna be heard. I can't wait to release this whole project I'm doing. I'm gonna quit recording, but before I do either of you want to mention how people can follow you or get in touch with you if you're comfortable with that?
Yeah. So I am at Odang, OHDANG, Mimi, MIMI on all of my social media. So that's on Instagram, Twitter, whatever else. That's where anyone can find me. That's also where I have like kind of my email and everything where people can contact me regarding things.
With me, I just try to stick with Twitter, and you can find me at Cup of Odang. That's CUPOFOHDANG.
And a heads up for viewers, I think both of your accounts are like not safe for work, just as a,
Yeah.
Completely.
because I am gonna have my classes watch this. So heads up, not safe for work. Don't be scrolling while you're on the job, y'all. Okay. Jokes aside, I am so again deeply appreciative of you both. The
We
We
energy,
appreciate getting to do this.
it's great to have a space to talk. This is not stuff normally spoken about, so it's nice to have a space to talk
Mhm.
about this.
I am so open to creating space for us to have more conversations. I think that it's healthy, especially for us to be able to talk about these things and with people who get it, who maybe have experience and who don't just fetishize us and sexualize us. Just can we just have complex conversations for the hell of it?
Yeah.
So, oh my God, God love you. What does the mom in Mean Girls say? God love you kids. You keep me young. I am so, so grateful for both of you. I am really looking forward to following up and having more conversations in the future. Thank you so much, each of you. I will be in touch.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop recording and then we can check in real quick.
Okay, yeah.